Chapter 1. The Accidental Capture. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the dusty hills, painting the sky in shades of fire and blood. Caleb Dawson's boots dug into dry earth as his horse, Dusty, moved in a steady trot across the prairie. He was alone today, just the way he liked it. A man didn't need much to survive out here. A horse, a rifle, and the will to keep moving. The wind carried the scent of sagebrush and dust, a constant companion that never seemed to leave. But something in the air today felt off, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Caleb squinted against the bright sun, his hand resting on the rifle slung over his shoulder. He was tracking a wild Mustang herd, the same herd he'd seen on these plains for weeks now, elusive and fast. But as he rounded the ridge, his gaze landed on something that didn't belong. A figure, slender and lithe, darted between the rocks ahead. His heart gave a beat of confusion. Not a Mustang, but a woman, and not just any woman. Her dark hair flowed behind her like a river, and her sharp, watchful eyes reflected a fire that caught him off guard. She was dressed in rough, weathered clothes that marked her as part of the Apache tribe. But what was she doing so far from the reservation? Before he could process the situation, his horse's hooves crunched over the dry earth, and she froze. In an instant, Caleb felt the weight of the moment, a feeling that was too quiet, too tense. Then, without warning, she turned and bolted, her feet kicking up dust as she disappeared into the brush. "Damn it," Caleb muttered, spurring Dusty forward. He wasn't sure why he felt the need to chase her, but it was instinct, the need to catch, to claim. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was a dangerous lure of something unknown, something wild. As he galloped through the rough terrain, the sound of his spurs clinking in rhythm with his heart, he could feel the heat of the chase settling deep in his chest. It took only minutes to catch up to her, but those minutes stretched long and painful. Caleb rode hard, Dusty's hooves pounding against the earth, sending up a flurry of dust behind him. She glanced over her shoulder once, her eyes wide with fear, but she didn't slow down. Her speed was something to behold. Just as he reached her, she made a sudden turn, and Caleb's hand shot out to grab her arm. The moment his fingers brushed against her skin, her body tensed like a coiled snake. She spun around, pulling a knife from her belt in one swift motion. Caleb froze. "Let go of me," she spat, her voice sharp like the blade she held. Her eyes flashed with a mix of defiance and fear. "I'll slit your throat if I have to." Caleb's heart hammered in his chest, but he didn't release her. Instead, his grip tightened and his eyes softened. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he said, his voice low and steady, though his pulse raced. "I don't know what you think I'm after, but it ain't you." The woman's eyes darted to the knife, then to his face. She was trembling, her breath shallow. Yet there was something about her, a fierce strength, a pride that wouldn't be broken. Slowly, her grip on the knife loosened, though she didn't lower it. "What do you want, then?" she asked, her voice quieter now but no less guarded. "I don't know," Caleb admitted, his words feeling foreign in his own mouth. He shifted on his saddle, his hand still wrapped around her arm. "I saw you running, thought maybe you needed help. But now I'm not so sure what to do with you." She was silent for a moment, studying him. Her expression was unreadable, yet he could feel the weight of her gaze, like she was trying to figure him out. Finally, she spoke, though her words were edged with distrust. "You captured me," she said bitterly. "I don't need help from someone who traps me like an animal." The words stung, but Caleb couldn't deny the truth in them. He had captured her. He had mistaken her for something else, and now he had no idea what to do with her. The air between them felt thick, charged with unspoken tension. Caleb's fingers itched for the reins, his instincts pulling him to ride away, to leave her be. But for reasons he didn't fully understand, he couldn't. The wind howled through the dry grass, And somewhere in the distance, a coyote's lonely cry echoed across the land. "I didn't mean to harm you," Caleb finally said, his voice rough. "I didn't." She didn't respond immediately, but as the sun dipped lower, casting its golden glow across the plains, she met his eyes again, and for the first time he saw something in her. Maybe it was a fear, maybe the uncertainty, but there was a flicker of something else, something soft, hidden beneath the layers of her defiance. And just like that, Caleb knew this wouldn't be the last time they crossed paths. Chapter 2, A Dangerous Bond. The soft creak of the wooden door echoed to the sparse cabin as Caleb stepped inside, the cool evening air following him in. The walls, rough-hewn and scarred by time, seemed to close in on him, the dim light from a single oil lamp flickering across the dust-covered floor. Nahele sat in the corner, her eyes still as sharp as a hawk's, but now something had changed. The fierce defiance had softened into wary calculation, and the knife she had brandished so quickly that morning lay beside her, unused but still within reach. Caleb stood at the threshold, his boots still caked with dirt from a ride. He was a man of action, but this was something different. She wasn't just a runaway or an intruder. No, she was someone with fire inside her, a kind of strength that made him uneasy in ways he hadn't expected. And that strength, well, it both terrified and intrigued him. "Are you hungry?" Caleb asked, his voice sounding too loud in the silence that hung between them. Nahele didn't answer at first, her gaze flicking briefly to the small wooden table, where a simple meal of beans and cornbread sat untouched. She shifted uncomfortably, but the stubborn pride that had flared when they first met still lingered in her eyes. She wasn't about to let him see her weakness. "I don't eat your food," she said, her voice low but steady, as though every word had been carefully chosen. "I'm not your prisoner." Caleb's jaw tightened, but he didn't snap back. He was used to the rough edges of people's words. Hell, he was one of them. Yet something about her struck him differently. Maybe it was her courage. Or maybe it was the way the light from the lantern made her skin glow like polished mahogany. Something untamed, unbroken. "I'm not here to force you into anything," Caleb replied, stepping closer, setting the plate down on the table between them. He kept his voice calm, almost gentle, though his heart beat heavy in his chest. "But I'm offering you a meal because that's what people do when they have guests, even ones who might not be happy to be here." She looked at him, her expression hard but unreadable. The silence stretched out, thick as the dust that clung to every corner of the room. Caleb took a breath, his eyes falling to the floor as he rubbed the back of his neck. Chapter 3, The Fire of the Heart. The air had turned cold as the days wore on, the chill of the approaching winter creeping in even as the sun still burned fiercely above the horizon. Caleb found himself restless, waking before dawn and heading out into the vast, empty plains without a real reason. His routine had always been the same: work the ranch, care for the horses, and keep the land running smoothly. But now, his thoughts kept drifting back to Nahele. She was an enigma, the anger in her eyes, the way she held herself as though she'd never known softness. It weighed on him in ways he couldn't ignore. At first, he'd kept his distance, thinking it was best to let her be. But after days of silence between them, the tension in the cabin had become unbearable. He couldn't help himself. He'd tried to avoid her. But there was something about her strength, something about the fire in her that called him like a moth to a flame. One evening, as the last traces of sunlight bled across the sky, Caleb found her in the barn, brushing down one of the horses, her movements graceful and fluid despite the hardness of her life. She was alone, the other hands off to the nearby saloon, where whiskey flowed and the sound of piano music spilled into the cold night. He hesitated at the doorway, watching her. "You're good with the horses," he said quietly, his boots shuffling on the dusty floor. Nahele didn't startle, though she had every reason to. Instead, She merely glanced over her shoulder, her dark eyes calculating, as though weighing whether or not to respond. The horse shifted beneath her hands, but she didn't seem to notice. "I've been around them my whole life," she answered softly, her voice a little warmer than usual, though still guarded. Caleb stepped into the barn, the familiar scent of hay and leather filling his lungs. His gaze followed her hands as they worked, steady practice, as though she'd always been here, always been a part of the land. "You know how to tame a wild horse," he murmured. "But I reckon taming a wild heart is a different kind of challenge." She stiffened at the words, her fingers freezing mid-motion. Nahele's expression remained impassive, but Caleb could feel the shift in the air, thick with the unspoken tension between them. "Maybe some things are meant to be tamed," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper, as she turned back to the horse. Caleb's throat tightened, and for a moment, he wasn't sure if she was talking about the animal or herself. 1,000 things flickered in his mind, but all he could do was stand there, feeling the weight of the silence stretching out between them. "I didn't mean that the way it sounds," he said, his voice rougher now, tinged with regret. He took a few steps closer, his boots making soft thuds against the barn floor. "It's just, this place, this life, it has a way of wearing a man down. You wouldn't know it from the outside, but it's the quiet ones that feel the weight the most." Nahele paused, her eyes flickering to him briefly, then back down to the horse. She didn't speak, but Caleb could see the internal battle playing out in her eyes, the way she was holding herself together, fighting not to let herself break. "I'm not like the others," she said, her voice barely a murmur. "I don't belong here. I don't belong anywhere." The word struck Caleb like a physical blow, the raw pain in her voice cutting through the walls she'd built. He stepped forward again, this time closing the distance between them, though still keeping a respectful distance. "Everyone belongs somewhere," Caleb said quietly, his voice thick with something he couldn't quite name. "Maybe you don't see it now, but this land, it's bigger than us. It has a way of pulling people in when they least expect it. You just have to trust it." She turned her head then, her gaze meeting his with a mixture of skepticism and something softer. "Trust you?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "I can't even trust myself, Caleb. You don't understand." The sharpness in her voice stung, but it wasn't anger that Caleb heard. It was fear, a deep, gut-wrenching fear, the kind of fear that could break a person apart if they weren't careful. "You're right," he said slowly, his voice softening. "I don't understand, but I'm trying. I'm trying to see past what's happened before and just be here with you, right now." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The sound of the horse's breathing filled the silence, and the last slivers of sunlight cast long shadows over the barn, the golden hue painting the scene like something out of a dream. Then, finally, Nahele spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to do with you," she admitted, her hands trembling slightly as she set the brush down. "You're nothing like the men I've known." Caleb didn't reply right away. Instead, he stepped closer, the warmth of his presence seeping into the cold air between them. There was no hurry, no rush. He didn't need her to make any decisions now. All he needed was to stand there with her, in the quiet of the barn, and let her know that he wasn't going anywhere. The tension between them felt like it was about to break, like the earth was holding its breath, waiting for something, an answer, a moment of clarity. But then, with a deep, slow breath, Caleb spoke, his voice hushed but steady. "Maybe that's the point. I'm not like the men you've known. I'm not trying to make you something you're not. I just want to be here." Nahele's eyes softened for the briefest of moments, and Caleb saw something in her, the first crack in the armor she had built around herself. It was faint, like the first hint of dawn creeping over the horizon, but it was there. "I don't know how to trust that," she said, shaking her head, "but I'm willing to see." And just like that, Caleb knew. They were at the edge of something dangerous, something that could change everything between them. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid. And neither, he thought, was she. Chapter 4. The Test of Loyalty. The wind howled through the open prairie, carrying with it the scent of dust and the promise of danger. Caleb stood at the edge of the ranch, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon, where dark figures moved like ghosts against a fading light. His hand rested on the hilt of his gun, the weight of it familiar. Yet tonight it felt different, heavier, almost ominous. The Apache had come. He'd known they would, of course. He'd heard the stories, the whispers of the tribe tracking their own, searching for the woman who had disappeared from their camp. But seeing them in the flesh, silhouetted against the dying orange glow of the sun, filled him with a cold certainty he hadn't expected. This was the moment that would decide everything. Beside him, Nahele stood with her back straight, her arms crossed in front of her, a defiant but fragile calm about her. Caleb could see the conflict in her eyes, fear for her people, for what would happen when they came face to face with him, but also something else, an understanding. She had always known this day would come. She had always known that loyalty to her people would pull her back to them, no matter what had grown between them here. "You don't have to stay, Nahele," Caleb said quietly, not taking his eyes off the riders. His voice was thick with the weight of the decision he knew he had to make. "I'll let you go. I won't fight them if you don't want me to." She didn't move for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, with a slight shake of her head, she stepped closer, her boots crunching softly in the dry grass. "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "You're not the only one who has a choice in this, Caleb." The words hung between them, both a challenge and a plea. Caleb's chest tightened, his gaze flicking to her, to the set of her jaw, the determination in her eyes. She was torn just like him, but there was no turning back now. The Apache warriors approached, riding hard across the prairie, their horses kicking up clouds of dust. Their leader, a tall, broad man with a scar running down his cheek, held up his hand, signaling his warriors to halt at the edge of the property. He didn't look at Nahele as he dismounted. His eyes, sharp and calculating, were fixed on Caleb. "You have something that belongs to us," the man said, his voice low and commanding. His accent was thick, the weight of years spent in the harsh lands of the West behind each syllable. Caleb didn't flinch. He could feel Nahele's presence beside him, her gaze on the leader of the Apache with a mixture of grief and resolve. She hadn't said a word to him since they had come out to face the warriors, but Caleb knew she was bracing herself for this moment. "I didn't steal anything from you," Caleb said, his voice rough but calm. "I didn't come for your people. I didn't come for war." The Apache leader's lips curled into a thin, cruel smile. "You may not have come for war, but that doesn't change the fact that you took one of our own." He stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Caleb's face. "You've had her long enough. She belongs with us." Caleb's heart skipped a beat, his mind racing. He couldn't just let her go, not after everything they had shared. But the Apache weren't just going to walk away. This wasn't just about her. It was about loyalty, about a culture that held its own with a fierce pride Caleb had never fully understood. Nahele stepped forward, her body trembling with emotion, but her face remained a mask. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the tension like a blade. "I belong to no one," she said, her voice steady, though Caleb could hear the sorrow in her words. She turned to face Caleb, her eyes softening just for a moment. "I've been torn between two worlds for so long. I don't know where I belong anymore." The words stung Caleb like a bullet to the chest, and for a split second, he couldn't breathe. He wanted to shout, to tell her she belonged with him, here, on this land, away from the pain of her past. But he knew better than to force that kind of decision on her. She had to find it for herself. "I won't fight for you if you don't want me to," Caleb said quietly, his voice heavy with the weight of that promise. "I'll let you go. I'll let you be free." Nahele's eyes flicked to the Apache leader, then back to Caleb. The wariness that colored her expression for so long seemed to melt away, replaced by something far softer. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something like understanding. "I want freedom," she said, her voice barely audible, "but I don't know where to find it." And then, to Caleb's surprise, she took a step back from him, moving toward the Apache warriors. The leader's eyes narrowed, and Caleb's heart lurched in his chest. "Nahele, no," Caleb said, his voice hoarse, desperate. She stopped just short of the Apache leader, her back straight and proud, but she didn't turn to face Caleb. Instead, she spoke to the warrior who had claimed her. "I will go with you," she said, her words quiet but resolute. "But not because I have to. I will go because it is my choice." The leader nodded once, the thin smile returning to his face. Nahele had made her decision. It wasn't about loyalty to him, to Caleb, or to anyone else. It was about her, about finding a place for herself in a world that had taken so much from her. And Caleb stood there, his heart breaking as he watched her walk away, knowing that this was a test of his loyalty, not to her, not to the Apache, but to himself. He had promised to let her go, and now he had to live with the consequences. As the Apache warriors began to mount their horses, Caleb looked toward the fading light of the setting sun, the empty horizon stretching out before him. The prairie, once a place of endless possibilities, now felt colder than ever. And as Nahele disappeared into the dusk, Caleb knew that neither of them would ever be the same again. Chapter 5. Crossing the Line. The cold wind swept across the prairie as Caleb stood on the porch of his small cabin, his eyes fixed on the dark silhouette of the mountains in the distance. He had spent days wandering the land aimlessly, the endless horizon a constant reminder of the emptiness that had settled inside him. His chest was heavy, weighed down by the decision he had made, the promise he had kept. Nahele was gone, no more than a fleeting presence in his life, just a memory now, like the setting sun that had burned so brightly before vanishing into the dark. The night was quiet, save for the soft creaking of the wooden porch beneath his boots. He had returned to the ranch, but it felt like a ghost town now. The horses in the stables seemed restless, as though they, too, felt the absence of the one person who had brought a spark of life into this barren place. Caleb's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, a storm he couldn't escape. He had let her go. He had stood there and watched her ride away, back to the Apache people who had raised her. But in the days since, a gnawing emptiness had taken root in his soul, something deeper than the loss of a woman, something he couldn't quite name. He had tried to convince himself that it was the right thing to do, that she belonged with her people, that freedom was hers to claim. But all those convictions fell hollow now, empty like the land he stood on. "Caleb?" The voice broke through his thoughts like a sudden clap of thunder, unexpected and sharp. He turned to see Nahele standing at the end of the porch, her silhouette framed by the dim glow of the lantern light from inside. She looked different, though not in the way he expected. There was no anger, no defiance in her eyes now, just a weariness, a quiet sadness that he had never seen before. His heart skipped, his breath catching in his chest. For a moment, he was frozen, unsure what to say or do. She had left. She had made her choice, and yet here she was again, standing before him, as if the last few days of separation had been nothing but a bad dream. Nahele's voice was soft, the edges of her words raw and fragile. "I had to come back." Chapter 5. The Cowboy's Promise. The days that followed Jack's confrontation in the saloon were filled with a heavy, almost tangible silence. Sarah could feel the change in the air, as if the entire town had taken a collective breath and was holding it, waiting to see what would happen next. Jack's presence was a quiet one, always just on the edge of the ranch, working the fields, mending fences, taking care of things with a sense of duty that felt too deep to question. He wasn't just here for a day or two anymore. Something had shifted between them, and now, more than ever, Sarah couldn't ignore the pull she felt toward him. The wind had picked up again, howling through the trees as the sun dipped low over the prairie, casting the land in a soft golden light. Sarah was outside, tending to the garden, trying to focus on something other than the ache in her heart. The baby had finally settled into a routine, and the hunger that had plagued them both for so long was now just a distant memory. But there was a loneliness that still lingered inside her, a quiet ache she couldn't quite shake. She was wiping her brow when she heard the unmistakable sound of hooves approaching. Her heart skipped a beat, a flutter of nervous excitement rushing through her. Without turning, she already knew it was Jack. The rhythmic sound of his horse's hooves echoed to the still air, the gentle creak of the saddle the only other noise in the vast emptiness of the land. When he finally appeared around the bend, Jack's figure emerged from the fading sunlight like a shadow, his tall frame outlined against the fiery sky. His hat was low, as usual, his expression unreadable, but there was a softness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Something in his posture had changed, less like a man burdened with the weight of the world, and more like someone ready to set it down. "Evening," he called softly, his voice carrying on the wind. "Got a minute?" Sarah paused, wiping her hands on her apron before turning to face him. Her heart fluttered in her chest, and for a moment she found herself speechless. Jack had always been a man of few words, but the way he looked at her now, like there was something he needed to say, but couldn't quite get the words out, made her stomach tighten. "I always have time for you, Jack," she said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. She immediately regretted them, but there was no taking them back. She turned away quickly, focusing on the garden again as she tried to hide the flush creeping up her neck. Jack didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't comment. Instead, he dismounted from his horse, his boots crunching on the dry earth as he walked toward her. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice steady, but the words seemed to hang between them like a cloud, thick with unspoken meaning. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, tied with a piece of twine. "I've been doing a lot of thinking." Sarah glanced at him, and then at the small bundle in his hand. She held her breath, her pulse quickening. He wasn't one to make grand gestures, not in the way other men did. But there was something about this moment, something about the way the light hit his face and softened his features, that made her heart skip. "I don't have much to offer, Sarah," he said, his voice low, barely above a whisper. "But I can offer you this." He held out the bundle, and when she took it, she was surprised to find a small, hand-carved wooden horse inside. Its surface was smooth, the edges worn down by someone who had worked with care. It was